This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for October 3rd, 2022. Let's start by taking a look at the map. I just want to remind everyone that this is liveuamap.com. It is very pro-Ukrainian, but let's take a look nonetheless. Let's zoom in to the south, the Kherson region. You can see the front line hasn't really changed except up here in the north. Now you notice these little salients, and these were created by the first and largest of Ukraine's offensives, and then it has just been extremely bloody, protracted fighting since then, and just Ukraine throwing men and machines into Russian defenses, being utterly destroyed, and just continuously doing this, hoping that they wear down Russian defenses. Now they've created this third salient right here along the Dnieper River, and they were pushing in quite quickly, and then they slowed down because they met stiffer resistance, Russian resistance. And now the same process of just sending men and machines in until they hope they overwhelm Russian defenses. This process will continue there as well. If we zoom out and move to the northeast, the northern Donbas region, Lyman, has been taken by Ukraine. Again, this was another area where Ukraine just continuously threw men and machines at Russian defenses for days, if not weeks. And then finally, they managed to encircle and take the city. But when we say encircle, it was operational. It was not a physical encirclement. Russian forces were able to withdraw to better defended positions. Like I said in my last update, I don't think Lyman was ever meant to be a frontline defensive position. Russia did not have the resources or the time, perhaps not even the interest in creating frontline defenses there at Lyman. They have created them further back, and Russian forces fell back to those positions. Now we'll have to see if those positions are indeed fully prepared for continued Ukrainian offensives. And when I say offensives, I mean Ukraine just throwing men and machines directly into Russian defenses. I'll get a little bit more into that here in just a moment. Russian forces continue making incremental progress around Bakhmut. This is a very strategic city. This is kind of the centerpiece of one of Ukraine's most formidable defensive lines. If Russian forces break through here, then that means Ukraine's defensive line has been broken, and now Russia can start rolling it up in at least two different directions. But I don't think that they're going to be doing that quite yet. I think they're going to wait for the mobilization to get into full swing. What is the strategic overview of this? We see Ukraine making this now extremely incremental progress. Around Kherson, at least in one area, and in the direction now past Lyman in the northeast. What does this all mean? I have compared this repeatedly to the Ardennes offensive. This was a single offensive that Germany organized at the end of World War II, taking everything that they had and throwing it at the Allied forces, hoping to create some sort of political situation that could end the war on political terms rather than military terms, which did not favor Germany. Alexander Mikuris of the Duran points out that at the end of World War II, Germany actually launched a series of offensives, and that this is much like that. And I have to agree, this is a much more accurate analogy. There were multiple offensives launched. And again, it's the same process. It was Germany trying to create conditions on the battlefield to force a political settlement rather than the military settlement that would have saw Germany's total defeat. And this is what Ukraine is attempting to do right now. And I don't think that it's going to work. Russia is extremely committed to prevailing. They have announced and are now implementing this 300,000 mobilization, this 300,000 strong mobilization, and they have incorporated Kherson, Zaporozhye, and the Donetsk and Lugansk regions into Russian territory. So that they're not about to allow this to end in some sort of premature political settlement. How is the Western media portraying this? And then let's look into the technical details of how we should actually be looking at this. So there's this AP article right here. Ukraine presses on with counteroffensive. Russia uses drones. And the AP article says Russia's loss of the eastern city of Lyman, which it had been using as a transport and logistics hub, is a new blow to the Kremlin as it seeks to escalate the war by illegally annexing 4 regions of Ukraine and heightening threats to use nuclear force. Now, it's not threatening to use nuclear force. Russian President Vladimir Putin's land grab has threatened to push the conflict to a dangerous new level. It is an escalation, to be sure. It also prompted Ukraine to formally apply for fast-track NATO membership. The only thing fast about that was how quickly NATO said, no, you're not getting into NATO like that. And then it says Russia's military didn't comment Sunday on Lyman after announcing Saturday that it was withdrawing its forces there to more favorable positions. So then I guess they did comment, didn't they? They said they were moving their forces to more favorable positions. The British military described the recapture of Lyman as a significant political setback for Moscow, and Ukraine appeared to swiftly capitalize on its gains politically in terms of media narratives. Of course, that's what that was all about. It is a political gain. All of these offensives, when you look at the big picture, are purely political. No matter how strategic they may seem for Ukraine, Ukraine does not have the ability to exploit them any further. Their ultimate goal is to expel Russia from all of what Ukraine claims as its territory, which includes Crimea. They simply lack the military capability to do that. There's no way for them to achieve this, and therefore what they're doing now is purely political. It's not only political gains, they're temporary gains. These are gains that Ukraine cannot consolidate or hold. And I think we're going to see that in the very, I would say, near to intermediate future. What is Ukraine trying to do right now? They're trying to deliver some sort of psychological or political blow to Russia. They're trying to create panic, hysteria, anger, division amongst Russian society, amongst Russia and its allies. And the only way for this to work is for people supporting Russia in this conflict to appeal to short-term emotions rather than just sticking to logic and reason. Now let's talk about logic and reason. Let's look at the fundamentals of this conflict and let's see what is actually going on here and who's in a more favorable position. It doesn't look like Russia is in a favorable position because you see Ukraine launching these offensives. They've had that success in Kharkov. They now have had success in Lyman. They're starting to peel one of the corners up in Kherson. So people are saying, well, it really looks like things are going Ukraine's way. Are they going Ukraine's way? The only way to tell is by looking at logistics and sustainment. Is this something that Ukraine can sustain? Or is this something they cannot sustain and something that they are actually doing that will leave them more vulnerable afterwards? Let's talk about first Ukrainian losses. Ukraine is losing huge numbers of tanks and armored vehicles, not to mention just human life being expended every single day. We're talking 10 to 20 armored vehicles a day. That's the Russian Ministry of Defense saying that. That's looking on Telegram and seeing pictures of just column after column of Ukrainian armored vehicles destroyed. When I say armored vehicles, I mean infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and also tanks. Now, in terms of tanks, if you have 10 to 20 armored vehicles total destroyed, you'll usually find about 3 to 5 tanks destroyed in there. But on some days, it could be more than 3 to 5. It could be many more than 3 to 5 tanks destroyed. By the end of all of this, since the offensive began to when the offensive is over, Ukraine is going to have lost somewhere like 100 to 200 tanks. It's hard to tell an actual number, but how do we put that number in perspective? Well, between the Czech Republic and Poland, as Ukraine's own tanks were disappearing off the battlefield, they sent somewhere between 230 to 270 T-72 main battle tanks to Ukraine. And this is what we are seeing mostly on the battlefield. Around Kherson, around Kharkov, around Liman, it's these Polish and Czech T-72s that were sent. These are being destroyed at a very quick pace, and the vast majority of them are going to be gone when this is all said and done. On an average day, Ukraine itself admitted it was losing between 100 to 200 troops. Since these offensives began, it's three times or more dead every single day. Again, that's according to Russian Ministry of Defense numbers, but it's also according to the Western media. I've now read from the Washington Post and the New York Times. These are media publications that actively lie on Ukraine's behalf, and yet they're also admitting the huge toll Ukraine is paying for these offensives and the I would call meager gains that they have achieved. The fact that Ukraine is losing huge numbers of men and equipment in these offensives, that is something that everyone on both sides seems to agree on. Now, Ukraine is taking all of these heavy losses. Can they replace them? The answer is no, they cannot. So they're losing these tanks, almost 300 tanks given to them because they were running out of their own main battle tanks. They're out of them. The vast majority of that 300 is going to be gone. What are they going to replace it with? Now, in a previous update, I talked about how NATO is now sending from Slovenia. They're sending T-55s. This is a post-World War II tank. This belongs in a museum. They say that they're modernized, but if you read the fine print, they were modernized in the 1990s, which means they are completely antiquated on top of antiquated. And they're only sending 28 of them. I just told you that Ukraine is going to lose the better part of 300 tanks, around 300 tanks. You're sending 28 museum pieces as a replacement. That is not a replacement. So where is Ukraine going to get more tanks from? And I have to be honest with you, I've not seen anyone come up with an answer. We've heard the idea of sending Western main battle tanks to Ukraine, but I have already explained why that is impractical just in terms of logistics, maintenance, and training. It would be an absolute nightmare. And the advantage that these tanks would have on the battlefield versus the disadvantages they would pose in terms of logistics, sustainment, and training, I don't even think that it would be equivalent to replacing what Ukraine already had at the end of February when this all started. I've heard talk of sending wheeled armored vehicles. So this is NATO saying we can't send tanks. Maybe we can send lighter armored vehicles. Well, they're more lightly armored. They have smaller armaments. The guns are less powerful. They shoot shorter distance. So what you're doing is you're putting subpar equipment in place of where Ukraine needs tanks. I mean, Ukraine started this with both light armored vehicles, wheeled vehicles, and tanks because they felt that they needed both. And the West is incapable of replacing their losses for both. Even in terms of armored vehicles, Ukraine is having a hard time finding replacements. Look at this article right here. This is from a very pro-Ukrainian source. Ukrinform. Ukraine asks Australia for more Bushmaster armored vehicles. And it says, Ukraine's foreign minister has asked the Australian government to consider supplying Ukraine with a larger number of Bushmaster armored vehicles. What do you mean by a larger number? How many did Australia send Ukraine in the first place? It says in May, Ukraine received from Australia 14 M11 tracked armored personnel carriers and 20 Bushmaster armored vehicles. 20. I have seen trains traveling through Russia, bringing equipment to the front lines, a single train with more than 20 armored vehicles going to Ukraine. So that's just to give you an idea of the quantity and the quality of the equipment that the West has been sending Ukraine, and the fact that it is trickling to a near stop because they are out. They're out of equipment that they themselves can transfer over to Ukraine and that Ukraine can practically and effectively use on the battlefield, which is why when you're looking at these offensives now in Ukraine, no matter how successful they may seem, they're completely unsustainable. There's no way for them to follow up on any gains that they make. And Russia knows this. Russia knows this. As a matter of fact, the further stretched out Ukraine is at the end of all of this, the better it suits Russia when it decides to start pushing back, when and if and where it decides to start pushing back. Now, what about Russian losses and Russian replacements? And this is how you look at the fundamentals of this conflict and you figure out who is in better shape at this point to continue on with the fighting. Well, we know that Russia is not suffering the same amount of losses during these offensives that Ukraine is. The Western media is even admitting this. They admit, the Washington Post admits around Kherson that Ukrainian troops that they're interviewing and officers that they're interviewing are saying that 5 Ukrainians are dying for every Russian soldier they managed to kill. And I will assume that that is taking place across the entire battlefield, except for very rare exceptions. And before the offensive started, it was probably a lot worse because Russian forces, by the very nature of the fighting, Russian forces have been taking advantage of their superior number, quantity, and quality of long-range fires. They have artillery, rockets, missiles, military aviation. They have been using all of this to attack Ukrainian defenses. And they're making advances very slowly, and the Western media has attempted to mock Russia over how slow their advances are, but they are advances nonetheless, and they are doing it this way specifically to avoid high casualties, but at the same time inflicting heavy casualties on Ukraine. Ukraine itself admits 100 to 200 dead every single day. So I've talked about this before. This is a New York Times article. I've covered it before. I've read from it extensively. In Ukraine's south, fierce fighting and deadly costs. And I just want to reread this one sentence very quickly. It says, "The problem is that we are advancing with no artillery preparation without suppressing their firing positions," said the commander of a volunteer military unit near the southern city of Mykolaiv. And yes, that is a massive problem. And it's a problem that Ukraine has no solution for. The solution to this problem is acquiring more long-range weapon systems, more artillery, more rockets, more missiles, and Ukraine doesn't have any extra, and the West doesn't have any extra to send Ukraine. So this is a problem they cannot solve. And what they have been doing in the meantime is just sending wave after wave of men and vehicles into Russian defenses, hoping to overwhelm them, in some places succeeding, in most other places not. But again, this is about Russian losses and Russian replacement. So you can see the nature of the fighting, why Russia is losing fewer men, fewer pieces of equipment. When they are replacing equipment, or now because of the mobilization increasing the amount of equipment in Ukraine, where is it coming from? Are they begging other countries to send them tanks? Do they have an issue replacing tanks or sending larger numbers of tanks into Ukraine? No. So let's look at some other articles. This is from Army Recognition. Russian Army receives new T-80 BVM tanks despite world economic sanctions. And what they mean by that is Western economic sanctions. The whole world is not sanctioning Russia, not even close. And it says updated T-80 BVM tanks passed the necessary tests. Hence, in the near future, they will go to the military units of the Russian army. This indicates that in spite of difficulties in getting some components previously coming from foreign countries, Russia succeeds in keeping a certain production of tanks and delivering them to the troops fighting in Ukraine. And you will see trainloads of tanks going from Russia to Ukraine. Here's another Army Recognition article. Again, these are Western sources, and they're talking about these Russian T-80s, how they're doing on the battlefield. So it says, discover first close tank battle in Ukraine between a Russian T-80 BV and Ukrainian T-64 BV. What it's talking about is a video clip of a Russian T-80 completely obliterating a Ukrainian T-64. So Russia is getting many more of these tanks that are outperforming their Ukrainian counterparts on the battlefield, that cannot be replaced. Here's yet another Army recognition article right here. Russia deploys in Ukraine new Typhoon-VDV K-4386 airborne mine-protected armored vehicles. And there's a picture of it. And you can see this large weapon station on the top. And I want to add on that weapon station also has day, night, and infrared optics, which means it can operate at any time of the day or night. Doesn't matter what the weather is doing, they can see the enemy just like it is high noon. And I have seen these weapon stations mounted on other wheeled armored vehicles that Russia is sending in numbers to Ukraine as part of this mobilization. So what is the point here? Why am I showing you this armored vehicle and explaining to you that it is being sent in large numbers to Ukraine? It's the fact that Russia has modern advanced weapon systems in numbers that it is able to send into Ukraine to continue fighting. When these vehicles are damaged, they themselves can repair them and get them back on the battlefield. They have warehouses full of spare parts because they themselves are the ones making these vehicles, and they have these facilities in places where Ukraine cannot touch them. Ukraine's situation, on the other hand, explained in articles like this from DW, German state media, Ukraine War, how to repair the Ukrainian army's modern weapons. And they're talking about repair facilities in Poland. So if you're fighting in the Donbas region and your weapon system breaks down, you have to send it 1,000 kilometers to Poland to get fixed, and then another 1,000 kilometers back to get it back on the battlefield. So who here has the advantage? Who can continue fighting this conflict sustainably and who cannot? It's very obvious. And let's talk about the Russian mobilization. We're talking about all of this new equipment that Russia has and is able to send to Ukraine. What about mobilization? The offensives that Ukraine has launched, no matter how successful they are, no matter how far into northern Donbas Ukrainian forces get, no matter how close to Kherson City they get, even if they somehow overtook all of Kherson City, it does not matter, because they are using everything that they have right now for these offensives. They are suffering huge losses in the process. These are losses they cannot replace. Meanwhile, Russia is preparing a mobilization of some 300,000 additional soldiers and associated equipment. They have currently 150,000 troops in Ukraine right now and associated equipment. They're going to take that number. It will be quadrupled, and they're going to have that number in Ukraine. So the Russian mobilization is first going to stop whatever advances Ukraine is still making by the time the mobilization is in full swing. And then they're going to start rolling it back. So all of this territory that Ukraine is taking right now, they are going to lose in the very near future. And this is exactly like what happened to Germany at the end of the war, World War II. They launched all of these offensives. They were successful temporarily, and then all of that territory that they gained was taken from them, and they had no reserve left to fight back, and they were left completely at the mercy of the Allied forces. And this is what is going to happen to Ukraine, barring NATO itself just entering into the conflict and doing the fighting themselves. So that brings us to the geostrategic level. Let's zoom out a little bit and look at the geostrategic implications of all of this. We're watching the US and its allies run out of military equipment they can practically transfer over to Ukraine and that Ukraine can effectively use on the battlefield. We're looking at sanctions that the West placed on Russia that were supposed to destroy the Russian economy. Instead, it's backfiring and devastating the European economy. And now we're looking at the Nord Stream pipelines. Attacked, destroyed to what extent, I don't know. And this leaves Europe with no immediate ability to reconcile with Russia. There is no exit for Europe now. And all of this makes extreme options we might have thought were highly unlikely, if not impossible. It makes extreme options more likely. I don't know how much more likely, but some of these more desperate measures might include setting up some kind of buffer zone inside Ukraine, or perhaps increasingly getting involved, I would say semi-covertly, in the fighting in Ukraine, sending larger numbers of NATO troops and equipment posing as mercenaries into Ukraine to fight Russian forces. This can escalate, and it can escalate now more than ever because other options, off ramps, exits, they've been demolished by whoever destroyed these Nord Stream pipelines. Now, the other side of the coin here is the more the West escalates the situation in Ukraine, the more able Russia is to develop this mobilization. They've done this partial mobilization of some 300,000 troops. Russia has millions of troops that they could mobilize if need be. And the more involved the West gets, more overtly, and the clearer that it is that the West is fighting in Ukraine against Russia to essentially destroy Russia, the easier the sell is going to be for Russia to the population, the government in Russia, to the population, that a wider mobilization is necessary. And I don't know if that is a chain reaction the West wants to get going. Let's talk a little bit about the UN Security Council vote. This is from Al Jazeera. Russia vetoes UN resolution on Ukraine annexation. China abstains. Now, listen to this very carefully. Russia has used its veto at the United Nations Security Council to scuttle a draft resolution that sought to condemn its annexations of Ukrainian territory. But even Moscow's close friends, China and India, chose to abstain rather than vote against the resolution that condemned the Kremlin's latest actions in Ukraine. Now, that's ridiculous. Everyone knows that when you abstain, it's almost the same as voting against it, against the resolution. There are political and diplomatic reasons why China and India need to abstain rather than vote directly against it. They have their reasons, but behind closed doors, they not only understand what Russia is doing, they agree and they support them to the fullest extent that they're able to. The leadership of China and Russia, they're realists, they're practical. They fully understand that a US-led international order is not going to allow either one of them to reach their full potential either. They fully understand that. They know that after Russia is going to be them next. The article goes on and it says, the United States ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, introduced the resolution to the Security Council meeting that called on member states not to recognize any altered status of Ukraine and obliged Russia to withdraw its troops. It also said that not a single country voted with Russia, not one, Thomas Greenfield told reporters after the meeting, adding that those that abstained clearly were not a defense of Russia. Well, Linda Thomas-Greenfield can tell herself that if that's what makes her feel better. But the reality is, yes, they are voting with Russia. And the whole reason these Western sanctions aren't hurting Russia the way the West imagined they would is because Russia and India are opening their markets for Russian exports that Europe is trying to sanction. Europe and the United States are trying to sanction. And because India and China are working so closely with Russia and represent an obstruction of U.S. foreign policy objectives, we can expect the United States place pressure on India and China. And in China's case, the most obvious example of this is Taiwan. The United States is trying to create for China the same type of national security threat through Taiwan that the U.S. created for Russia in Ukraine. It's actually much worse in China's case because Taiwan is actually part of China. So the United States is interfering within the boundaries of what is recognized as China to create a national security threat, to trigger a armed conflict with China. It's extremely dangerous. In the past, I might have said that I don't think that it'll escalate to something too dangerous, but after watching what was almost certainly the United States just trying to completely destroy the Nord Stream pipelines and incapacitating them for the time being, I would say almost anything is possible. They are extremely desperate. The desperation is palpable. They're capable of almost anything. We really got to keep a close eye on this. We have to keep a close eye on what's going on in Ukraine and between the US and Russia, but also between the US and Russia's closest allies, which include China If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram. I update that several times a day. I'm also on Odyssey and Rumble, where all of my YouTube videos are automatically backed up on. It could take a day or two, but they'll show up. Closed captions will also show up in a day or two. I have no control over that. They are enabled. YouTube auto-generates them whenever YouTube auto-generates them. So I appreciate your patience in that regard. In the video description below, you will find all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube videos, so if an ad pops up, please feel free to skip through it. It's not doing me any good at all. In the video description, you will find links to buy me a coffee, Patreon, and also PayPal. And to everyone who has been contributing, thank you so much. That's what makes this work possible. And as always, thank you for watching.